Okay, welcome back, everyone. And here we are on the program on the Master of Science in Bioethics, the course on the fundamental principles on bioethics from the Catholic perspective, and today's lecture on selection. So we begin, as always, with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, we thank you for all your many blessings. We ask that you be with us today, that you inspire us to continue delving into the natural processes that surround us so that we may understand nature and including our own human nature as we seek to develop a deep theological anthropology, a vision of the human person, which at the same time is respectful of your inspiration and your revelations through our faith, and also the biological facts that surround us. As always, we ask for those who are in most need of your divine mercy at this time. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, any questions from previous lectures or comments? Anything at all? No? You're okay? You see how the summaries go? Okay, before getting actually into selection, I've been meaning to cover a little bit of Meyer's chapter 4, which I said you could read if you wanted to, but it's not, it wasn't required. And I think I had, where did I have it? Just one slide on it from the previous lecture. Let's see. Because as we know, Meyer was a great biologist and he was involved in that whole synthesis of bringing biology into the 20th century, combining the theory of evolution from Darwin and others, and also the genetics of Mendel. But unfortunately, on the, let me see if I can find it. I had a little diagram. On the side of theology or philosophy, he's very critical about that. And in my opinion, it's simply that he did not have the background. Here we go. Yes. He did not have the background formally, to my knowledge, to talk about these issues. Okay, so he mentions, I'll just bring it to the synthesis. He mentions in chapter 4 that, in his opinion, religion and what he's calling essentialism slowed down the progress of science, especially from the 16th century forward, when we have the Copernican revolution and all of the interventions, if you will, of the church, let's say, for example, with the Galileo affair and others. But unfortunately, it's two different realms of reality. There's a physical reality, which involves studying material things, including energy, which anything that can be measured, measurable. But then there are these metaphysical realities, which he brackets and at the end of the day discards, simply because he's a scientist and the metaphysical realities cannot be measured with instruments and are not sometimes as evident to plain sight and to the external senses, because the external senses are picking up stimuli, again, from either matter or energy, right? The light that is hitting our eyes and so forth, or the heat that we feel with our skin. But it doesn't mean that because we cannot detect these realities with our external senses that they don't exist, right? And rather we get at them with what we would call an internal sense, or reasoning, and which is aided also with revelation, what we call divine revelation, which would be sacred scripture. So I wanted to talk a little bit about essentialism here, because it's very critical about essentialism, and the problem is the ism, right? In other words, whenever we have an ism, it's an exaggeration. Mm-hmm. But the aspect of essential as such, that there are essences, because he ends up rejecting essences, or what he also calls types, okay? Or essences. He says there are no types, there is only species and varieties within species, and then this that these varieties are evolving constantly. However, the problem is that essence is one of the philosophical categories that we deal with, and it's contrasted with accidents. So we have things, we have the essence of things, and then we have the accidents of the things that surround us. Mm-hmm. And so when I say chair, for example, which I'm going to use right now to sit down, all right? We have an intuition over time and life. We have an intuition of what is chair. So we can talk about chairness. In other words, we see a bunch of chairs here in the room, and as we look at all the chairs in the room, we see that there are 4 different types of chairs, okay? 4 different shapes of chairs. You're probably saying there are only 3. So we have the chairs that you're sitting on, this black one over here, and this one over here. But there's another one behind you over there, a purple one, that you probably haven't spotted yet. But now that you've spotted it, we can say there are 4 different types or 4 different shapes or styles of chairs in this room. But they're all chairs, okay? And if we were to go to China, for example, where we've never been before, assuming that you've never been there, and we see a chair, we say, oh, chair. And we've never seen that chair before, okay? But we recognize it as chair. It's so obvious and evident. What are we recognizing? Well, we're recognizing chairness, right? There's an essence there. In other words, that is different from, let's say, when I see a chair, it's different from a door, and when I see a door, it's different from a cloud, and so forth. Grammatically, what do we call that category of things when we name them like that? We're naming them, that's the hint, so they are nouns. They're the nouns. Now, the formal name for noun is a substantive in grammar. En español, el sustantivo. So the noun is the essence of the thing, is the substances, because it tells us the substance, which is a philosophical category, all right? And so we can intuit normally, on average, for normal people with a normal background and upbringing and so forth, all right? We can tell the essence of things, and that's essential because it allows us to communicate, and we can translate those into other languages also. And typically there is a category for nouns in just about any language. Of course, there are over 4,000 or 5,000 languages in the world, so I couldn't say that for a fact because I don't know. But my intuition is that there would be a category like noun or substantive in just about any language. For example, Father, you speak Hindu or you know Hindu. Is there a category that would reflect nouns, substantive? Yeah, it's very obvious, right? Okay, so that is the essence of the things, including human nature. We can talk about human nature, you know, which is one substance. Then there are the accidents, right? For example, chair. Chair can be a wooden chair, can be a metal chair, can be a plastic chair, can be a green chair, can be an orange chair. See, but now we're adding adjectives, right? Which are accidents. Bless you. In other words, we are describing different qualities of the chair. Those are the adjectives, and those are qualities and quantities. We can talk about 10 chairs, or we can talk about 1 million chairs. So qualities and quantities of essence are the accidents. Whether a chair is green or blue doesn't affect its being a chair as such. All right, as long as it's still a chair. And again, those are the, what we call philosophically, the accidents. And in grammar, there is the adjective. And so we can talk about human nature, and we can talk about people. We can talk about tall people, short people, young people, old people, you name it. There are many qualifiers, right? They're all adjectives. But that doesn't deny the fact that we're all people. In other words, a tall person is not more of a person than a short person, because we're all essentially persons, human persons, all right? And even though sometimes society, especially without getting into philosophy, will put qualifiers, you know, and we appreciate more, I don't know, people who are young, people who are in shape, people who are pretty, and etc. You know, we put all these qualifiers, and they may tend to have some more value for some people, but we know that that's not proper, that's not correct, because substantially we are all human, and that's also where reason will have its limit, and then the faith kicks in, what we call divine revelation, and God gives us that beautiful passage in Genesis that we're made in God's image, right? Which, by the way, is not only Christian, it's Judeo-Christian, right? So we have this tradition for thousands of years where we are sacred because we are God's image. Mm-hmm.
Question. Yeah. Is that true that God only looks at the heart, not at the external?
Of course, because the external is going to change, has been changing over time, all the time, right? And will continue to change until we rot in the grave. So the external is going to change, no question about it.
Is it superficial then?
Is not superficial. What do you mean by superficial?
Like that we shouldn't hold it as like to a high esteem, you know, the physical characteristics.
Exactly. Exactly. So in that sense, it's superficial, but at the same time, we are integrated body and soul one. So our body is also an integral part of our being. Now, this body changes all the time because we started as a single cell, and it's been a long time since then, because now we have trillions of cells. Okay. So there is like a stewardship for our bodies, that we should take care of our bodies, all right? But when it becomes excessive, then we are devoting energies to something that that is too much energy in that direction. Okay, and yet we know that many people in society are there. You know, it's all about the culture of looking good and all that. Now we should obviously look decently, but when it becomes an all-absorbing thing, we are too. We've just become too self-absorbed, because there are other values that we need to take care of, like caring for other people and relating and interacting and so forth. But what I wanted to say about this is that sadly, Meyer rejects this essentialism, all right, which I grant him that several things. Number one, there was a much more static vision of nature before the Copernican revolution, right? A static vision in the sense that the number of species that we're seeing, plants and animals, etc., were just taken for granted, that they were fixed in time, and that they didn't really evolve. The concept of evolution wasn't really there, like changing species, okay? So it's true that it was a much more static vision of nature before the Copernican revolution. And even there were many skeptics that resisted what science was bringing forward. For example, that the Earth is not the center of the universe and so forth. Also, there was, because the Bible was known for centuries, in fact, Gutenberg, which I think was where his 1400s or 1500s, he actually invented the printing press to print what? One book specifically. You've heard of Gutenberg, yes? Gutenberg was the one who invented what is known as the precursor of the modern press, right, of the printing press. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1400s. And he invented the press for one particular, or the typing, you see, he invented this. A couple of things. You people ever heard of Gutenberg? Invented this typeset, right? To set the letters in little blocks and put them on a strip and then print that. And he can print many of his name, for example, on a piece of paper that have been established and so forth.
Before the typewriter?
Much before, yeah. This is the precursor of the typewriter and even the computer in one sense or another, certainly the printer. Okay, so you see all this machine, and he would press it first, and he would press one folio at a time. And it would come out, and then he would review each line and correct what was offset and so forth. So he invented basically the printing press, and the motivation was to print one book, which was the Bible. In other words, he wanted to diffuse the teachings of the Bible. He was Protestant, I don't believe, well, 1400s, I'll take it back because it's before the Protestant Reformation. So he was Catholic. It was before the Reformation. Right, so, and why was I saying all this? I need to find my train of thought. Yes, the Bible. And the Bible pretty much was also being interpreted literally. In other words, there was a certain naivete, if you will, an innocence about humanity and the thought process for many people, especially in the general population, whereby the animals and plants that existed, people just assumed that they always existed that way, including the human nature, which they really didn't see themselves very much like animals. But he was static. And also with regards to the Bible, he was pretty much taken literally by most people, in fact, even professors and so forth, even up to the time of Darwin, which I mentioned many of his professors were Anglican, and they were also scientists, but they took the Bible quite literally, just at its plain word. So that was kind of the prevailing interpretation of the Bible was a fundamentalistic interpretation. Okay, so those were actual big problems, if you will, that Meyer is picking up and has a gripe on that aspect. Since then, there's been a lot of depth of thought and insight and study, and research, and analysis, and reflection. What I find a little ironic is that by Meyer defining the biological, giving us the biological definition of species, able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring, that biological definition of species, if you think about it, species is pretty much philosophically what we would say the essence of the species. For example, Homo sapiens. We're all human beings. It's what we call human persons, right? Biologically, we're called Homo sapiens. which distinguishes us from any other species, any other animal or plant or fungus or bacteria in the world. So it is our essence. Our essence biologically is Homo sapiens, because we're all Homo sapiens regardless of our age, size, ethnicity, all the other adjectives. Okay, so it's kind of ironic that he comes with a definition that is the essence of each species out there. And I think maybe his difficulty, well, to my knowledge, he did not have a formal training in philosophy anyway, much less in theology. But also it was at the beginning of last century and toward the middle of last century that theological advances were going on, and also biblical studies, ironically in the Protestant camp first. And then it was spilled over into the Catholic camp, if you will. But these biblical studies where the scholars were saying, no, we cannot interpret the Bible literally because we run into problems. We rather have to look at the deeper meaning of the passage, what we call the sensus plenior. And this is a little anticipation what we're going to get into in a couple of, about 2 or 3 lectures when we look at the theological merging, if you will, the theological anthropology merging with the biological. Okay, so I'll give you a little overview of the Bible when we get into that lecture. But basically, today we certainly don't interpret the Bible literally, and so these essences, this essentialism that he was complaining about, is kind of naive, and because it will deny the substance, the substantive, which is really what he's calling biological to the species. So he's shooting himself in the foot in a sense when he gets rid of this essentialism of these types. Anyway, it's this forever challenge of dealing with the physical and the metaphysical. We have capacity for both, but we have to keep them in their proper realm. And some of the categories in one realm or universe are not going to fit in the other. Because again, certainly in the metaphysical realities, the metaphysical world or universe, we cannot use instruments or machinery like we use in the physical world to measure it. And that's why the metaphysical is not empirical, and it doesn't fall under the empirical sciences, but it does fall under the philosophical and the theological sciences, okay? Because there's a method, there's a discipline to study them. And finally, one last thing, it could be that in German, it turns out, I don't know if any of you speak German or know some German or read German, whatever, but I took a little bit of German when I was studying in Rome, my first doctorate. And it turns out that in German, the adjective and the noun are linked together, and it's a single word. It's a single word, right? For example, kleine Auto. Kleine Auto would be the small car. And car is a noun, and this car happens to be small in contrast to other cars which are larger. In kleine Auto, they would write together. Kleine is small, Auto is car, all right? So many of the nouns in German also have the adjective associated with it. And that's why in German sometimes you see words that the middle of the middle letter has a capital. It's a uppercase. You'll see a word, and in the middle of the word there's an uppercase letter, because that's where the noun starts. Okay. So maybe it's part of the background that the adjective and the noun are not that clearly distinguished in German language. And that's why he may have some difficulty with accepting the substance, right? The essence of things in and of themselves, distinct from the qualifiers, which we call accidents philosophically or theologically. But in the Romance languages, the Romance languages, which is not German. It's Spanish, Italian, French. What I'm forgetting? Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. Right? Those are the five modern languages that are derivative of Latin, which in itself is a derivative of Greek. In those Romance languages, we make a very clear distinction between the substance, between the noun and the adjective. Anyway, all this to say that we maintain those categories. It's essential for us to maintain the category of substance. Otherwise, we're not able to do an objective bioethics. Okay, it's all going to be subjective. It's all going to be relativistic. It's important to rescue that from the ethical perspective, the moral perspective, the substance of things. All right, enough about that. You can go back now with this little insight and read that chapter 4 critically and see where his shortcomings are on that respect. Now, back to selection. We're going to go look at these three types of selection, all right? Artificial, natural, and sexual. So again, there we go. This is the noun. We cannot get away from it. We're looking at selection. There are different types of selection. One is artificial, the other one is natural, and the other one is sexual. And they each have their own characteristics. So let's look at artificial selection first, because we have been involved, we humans, humanity, has been involved in artificial selection for centuries and maybe even millennia. Yes, indeed, millennia, ever since we started doing agriculture, all right? So we go back in our anthropology, in our origins, we were first what is known as hunter-gatherers, human species, and we were definitely human already back then, able to mate and produce fertile offspring of the same species. So we were human, and yet we roamed around the world, basically following either herds of animals, wild animals, or picking the berries and eating whatever was available to us and would not poison us. And a number of people got sick or died in the process of finding out what was edible, what was not edible, and what was poisonous and what was lethal. Okay. But if hunger strikes, then something may look appetitive and we go for it. And then we find out later it may or may not be edible. But at some point, there was some kind of happening between grains that were coming out a little larger, because if you see wild wheat is very tiny, okay, like any wild fruit and vegetables. Wild wheat. I'm talking about the origins of, yes, the origins of agriculture. So here's wild wheat, and there's not much edibility there. The grains are small and spiky and hairy, so you don't get much nutrition out of that. But if you're hungry enough, you eat enough of these, they will start satisfying the hunger for about half an hour, and then you got to go back to it again. But you see, over some varieties were coming up in the Middle East in what is known as the Fertile Crescent today, the confluence between the Tigris and the Euphrates, what is today pretty much Iraq, Iran, that area. Fertile, which is thought where civilization began, agricultural civilization. What's a good map? It's in the Middle East. You can see the Arabic Peninsula. Oh, well, this one's a little bit. Yes, these two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? Here's the Persian Gulf. Here's the Mediterranean. What is this island here? Cyprus. Yeah, Cyprus and Crete. I think it's divided. No, well, Crete would be over here. But Cyprus is divided. Half belongs to Turkey today, and the other half, I think, belongs to Greece. Anyway, this is the Arabian Peninsula. Then we get into Africa over here, Egypt, the Nile. In modern times, let's see what's here. This is still ancient. Anyway, Iran and Iraq and those other countries here in the Middle East. This is Turkey up here, right? My point is that it is thought that this is where agriculture began. Where agriculture began. Oops. I received that the wrong way. Yes. Okay. About 7,000 years ago. And it was because these hunter-gatherers found some wheat that was a little larger. It was some kind of a mutant. They could get more grain out of it. So they stuck around and cultivated that grain more and more. And then it was kind of an intuition to take the bigger of the lot when they would collect the grain. Let's say they would harvest the grain and they would collect the bigger grains and use those bigger grains for planting them. They realized that the bigger grains would tend to give also bigger ears of the grain of wheat, right? And from that second lot, they would again gather them. There would be a range of size of grains. They would again pick the bigger ones for planting those and so forth. So what are they doing? They're selecting. They're selecting on what? They're selecting on grain size. Why? Because the idea is that the grain size, the bigger the grain, the more nourishment there is for each plant, for each ear of the grain, right? Each ear of the wheat. And so eventually they're doing artificial selection whereby you can compare these domesticated varieties, right? Contrasted to the wild wheat. You can see that it has much more grain. It's clustered together. They're larger and they're easier just to shift out even by hand. Because this is still very primitive agriculture. It's what we call primary agriculture, still depending on nature, depending on rain and the seasons, okay? And if anything, they would have some surcos. What is a surco? Is a little trough on the ground to kind of channel the water. So the trough we can see as a precursor of a pipe, right? Functionally, it has the same function, which is to channel water in the wheat field and so forth, but it's still depending on rain. At some point, maybe they tapped into a river or a stream and deviated it with a canal into the area where they were doing this primitive agriculture. They go into secondary and tertiary agriculture, the more equipment and machinery and methods that they use into it. But all this to say that what is happening is selection. And because this is beyond what nature is doing, right? It's an artifice of man, of the human. It's an endeavor, it's an artifact of the human, and therefore is artificial selection. It's artificial selection. So that's an example of artificial selection, and we have gotten extremely good at it ever since the past 5,000 years. We have identified practically every possible fruit that is edible and selected on it, typically for size. So, for example, the precursor of the apple is a little tree called the crab apple, the wild crab apple, which is more of a bush. And the wild crab apple, the actual apple, is the size of a cherry. What is a cherry today? But look, with selection, what we have come up with over the centuries, selecting on the bigger apples on the crab apple, right? So we take these seeds and plant those and so forth. Now we even do genetic engineering, where we put actually the double genome, we double it up, and these apples typically become what we call tetraploid. Instead of having just two sets of chromosomes diploid, like 2N, they're 4N or sometimes 8N, and that makes them larger. So we have been doing selection on plants and animals for many reasons. Agriculture for sure. For example, look at this. You're familiar with cauliflower and broccoli, cabbage, kale, and then this other thing called kohlrabi. Kohlrabi, all of these plants come from wild mustard, different parts of the wild mustard, okay? The leaves, the stalk, the flower, the little bud. So all of these, the meristems, so all of these different vegetables today are derivatives of the wild mustard. Amazing. Selecting out particular qualities over the years and the centuries. So these are all examples of artificial selection. Also, on the animal side, it's called animal husbandry, right? Animal husbandry, which is the care and maintenance of animals, the domestication of animals, again, typically for food, right? So that all of these animals, I mean, the wild horse was the size of a dog. Of course, that horse evolved naturally to a bigger size, but then we domesticated or semi-domesticated the horse. A miniature donkey, again, was selected for the small size so that they can be used in the kids' playground or whatever. The wild turkey is smaller than the cultivated turkey that we'll be looking at next month for Thanksgiving. Chickens, wild chickens, yeah, the wild chickens are tiny, okay, little things, and so on and so forth. So typically we select on animal husbandry and agriculture, we select for size, get more bulk, get more food out of the individuals. Other selections are a little more sophisticated and is trying to save money. So there are chickens that are featherless chickens, right? They have been engineered genetically so that they don't grow any feathers. And that way they don't have to be plucked. And it saves on the plucking because I think the plucking is a manual thing. I don't think it can be done by machinery because it may destroy the chicken in the process. And so manual labor, you got to pay union fees and you got to pay pension and you got to pay, all the benefits. And so it's much more expensive. But if you get chickens that don't have feathers, you don't need that kind of labor, right? The downside with a featherless chicken is that the skin is exposed and is very exposed and is tender and frail. And so they have to be maintained on the cover because ultraviolet light fries them and makes them mutant. And yeah, so they cannot be exposed to the outside. So you got to maintain them in an environment, which they are, they're stacked up and so forth. And it's all artificial temperature and humidity and lighting, and the feed comes in and out automatically and all that, so automated, all to save money on the labor, right? And finally, even in the pet industry, a lot of artificial selection in pet industry. As you can see, all these are variants of parakeets. All the many different colors. It happens also in aquarium fish and so forth. So we've been doing artificial selection for centuries, for millennia. And it's gotten very sophisticated. Now we're down to the level of the genes, of genetic engineering, okay, in some cases. In other, it's still the traditional standard artificial selection of selecting from the progeny the varieties that we're interested in. Emma.
I have a question about what makes the chicken organic, like the eggs. Organic.
Right, so organic, I think there's, in my mind, this is my opinion, there are a couple of aspects to organic. One is the health issue, and the other one is just the publicity issue. Because we know that organic costs more, and the idea is that organic has been raised with natural feed, whatever natural feed is. Obviously, I think chickens and animals like that are supposed to feed outside. They're not kept in cages and not kept in warehouses or these, they're not warehouses, but they're like huge barns, the other chickens, okay, where they're kept. For organic chickens, I guess they're allowed to roam around in a patch of grass or something like that. I'm just guessing, but that's the idea, that they're raised more naturally than the other animals. And then for plants, I think organic pretty much boils down that they're not going to use artificial fertilizers and other things, even antibiotics that they put in food and other chemicals, right? Pesticides, for example, not supposed to use pesticides or fertilizers on organic plants. And so you see that they're not as perfect, if you will, those organic products. And they're supposed to have more taste and all that. And supposedly we're not contaminating ourselves with the trace of the fertilizer or whatnot. Some people go organic on animals for the ethical aspect, that they consider unethical the way that the other animals are caged and restricted and manipulated. So, but I think there's also a big market on it now because it's gotten attraction in it's popular.
Organic, natural, and they say the natural is another thing too.
Is it beyond? Yeah, I guess.
I think that is without hormones.
Okay.
We have like created these categories, but we don't know if it's true.
Right. How do you know, right? At the end of the day, there's an element of trust there. One thing that we know is going to cost you more.
It's not
That is for sure. Okay. Supposedly, the way to get these animals to be so big is they give them growth hormones. And those hormones are similar to the human growth hormones. And so that's one theory of why we've gotten bigger also as the years go by, especially in the Northwestern Hemisphere. But also the idea that kids are maturing faster today, teens are hitting puberty younger, faster, and some people are attributed to meat and the growth hormones given to cows and cattle that stays in the meat as it's processed. Some of it, not all, but some, because some of it will be destroyed when it's cooked. It's called denaturing, when typical hormones are proteins and complex molecules, but when they're heated up to a certain temperature, they denature, they unfold, and they lose their activity, their properties. But not always, and especially rare meat, well, it's less cooked and so forth. I think it's still controversial. Some claim that they have measured it, and there's literature out there, but it's controversial. One thing that we can say also is that organic is popular with a certain culture of people, right? And so I don't know. It's complicated. But the whole point here is that artificial selection has been going on for millennia. And basically, we're mimicking nature, but we do it much faster because it's a directed selection as opposed to nature, where it's much a slow process. Because there are many other factors, and including the chance factor is very big in nature, in natural selection, which we take out as much as possible in artificial selection, because it is directed, it's oriented specifically to any number of traits that we're trying to enhance. And that is also, since I'm on that point, it's important to know, in contrast with natural selection, right? For natural selection, there is no direction preset necessarily. There's no preset direction, okay? So from that aspect, we can say that God is kind of letting it go. God established certain fundamental rules that are happening as we evolve throughout the universe. But it's kind of the big picture. It's not that God directly intended for the, let's say, the Eohippos to become an Echos over X 45 million years or whatever it was, right? So the direction, if you will, was first of all by chance, and secondly, the selective aspect that in general, for mammals, the bigger they are, the better chance they have to survive because the faster they can get away from predators or can intimidate predators to go away and so forth. Okay, so there's a general tendency to getting bigger, faster, etc. But it's reactive. It's not proactive. Okay, it's not a pre-orientation, if you will. It's not a preset orientation. Rather, it's a consequence of survival. It's a consequence of survival. So what I want to do now is I want to look at 5 observations that Darwin made, and then 5 conclusions or inferences that he deduces from these 5 observations, okay? And these 5 inferences, stepwise, are what led him essentially to come up with this theory of evolution. So we'll begin with the first one, which, by the way, natural selection is presuming random mating, okay? Which is not the case most of the time in nature. It's not the case. So this is even a simplified version of what is actually occurring in nature. But as humans, we need to break it down like this and to simplify it a little bit in order to get a grip on it. So let's begin with this first observation. And then what I have is I have a slide for each one of these to show you 1 or 2 slides what is going on functionally in nature, all right? The first observation was the high fertility rate, prezygotic, and which leads to the zygote in whatever species. So for example, there's an overabundance of gametes, right? Let's say with mammals. We know that mammals, we have male and female, the egg and the sperm, and whereas they're on average in one cycle, but that's only for the human, there's 1 egg matured per cycle, 1 egg ovulated, but there are millions of sperm, hundreds of millions of sperm in every ejaculate. Then when we get off the human into other mammals, we see that they actually ovulate several eggs at once. You know, a dog will have several puppies at once, a mouse, the litter, 4, 6, 8, she may drop 10 baby mice in 1 litter. All right, so she had to ovulate 8 or 10, maybe more, but not all got fertilized. But certainly on the male side, there will be millions of sperms each time. On the fish, even more so, when we look at fish, for example, animals that reproduce sexually but have external reproduction, in other words, there's no mating, the fish will lay out the eggs, and then the male will come and fertilize. The female will lay out the eggs, and then the male will fertilize the eggs. But there's an overabundance, right? And so this led him to conclude that the vast majority of these gametes either don't fertilize, or if they do fertilize, the zygotes don't get to survive, don't make it to adulthood, all right? Otherwise, we just in 1 generation would be swamped with mice and fish and birds and every other living creature that's out there, just from 1 generation to the next. So the vast majority, it's not just a few, but the vast majority of individuals in society, of the gametes first, don't get to fertilize, and when they do, the vast majority of those zygotes don't really progress. They die early in embryonic stage. Okay? They typically become food for other living creatures. Next observation, that populations in nature remain more or less stable. In other words, when we look around, as we look out the window today, we see a stable number of trees there. Slowly, as the bigger trees die with age, or they get hit by lightning or whatever, new seedlings will be coming up and replacing, but there's a certain stability in the number of species that we see out there, even down to the level of the grass, the bacteria, the birds. Some are migratory. I've seen more birds now in the fall. They were reproducing in the spring, then the chicks were hatched and were fed during the summer, and now I see the young birds flying around in flocks. It is seasonal, but it's more or less the same number that were here last year. The other ones died. New ones were replaced by chicks that were hatched this season. So the populations pretty much remain stable. So that means that the vast majority of individuals that are growing either don't make it to reproductive age, or if they make it to reproductive age, they don't get to reproduce, they don't get to mate, they didn't find a mate, or if it was external reproduction, they just didn't get to reproduce for any number of reasons, okay? The stability of populations over time is, again, an observation. This is on the biotic factors. These two first ones are biotic factors because we're talking about living things, right? But then you notice that also there are limited resources. Well, this one is also biotic. I take it back. The third one is also biotic. Typically, it has to do with plants at the first level of the pyramid, of the feeding pyramid. There's a limited number of resources for every species. So there's X amount of grass there, if we had whatever is feeding on that grass, okay? And then the next level, let's say that mice are feeding on that grass. Well, there's a limited number of mice that will grow on that amount of grass. And therefore, the hawks that are feeding on the mice, it's also going to be a limited number because there's not an unlimited supply of mice out there, okay? So the resources, especially for feeding the next level, are always limited. He deduces from that is that there is a tremendous selection pressure, the selective pressure, acting on populations all the time. There's a selective pressure. Sometimes the pressure is stronger than others, depending. You know, if one year 3 or 4 hawks actually got to hatch and grow, then there's more selective pressure on the population of mice than the previous year where there are only 1 or 2 hawks around. You got 3 or 4 hawks and the same number of mice. Well, the mice are going to feel more pressure this year than they felt last year because there's twice the number of predators hunting them down. So we can think that there is selective pressure going on all the time. And that's why we have limited resources. Now, this one is on variety, emphasizing that within any population, meaning one species, which Darwin still was not clear, let's say, on the definition of species, but within any one population, no two individuals are exactly identical. I even gave you an example last time with identical twins, monozygotic twins, that they still have some slight, subtle variations, right? So what rules is the variety, and therefore the probability of survival for each individual will vary regarding the complexity of variations that they have. And the variations between the individuals and within the individual. So there are many, many characteristics. We can think of thousands of different characteristics that we each have, right? And there could be a variation on each one of those. There's the whole complexity of it. Finally, that many of these variations are inherited, right? They're heritable. They can be passed on to the next generation because they were also acquired from the previous generation. In other words, the fact that, you know, we have 2 arms and 2 legs, well, we acquired that from our parents, and our parents acquired it from their parents, and so forth. So likely, when humans procreate, their children will also have 2 legs and 2 arms, right? And so these variations are inherited, on average, inherited. He did not have the mechanism for inheritance, but he intuited that they are, he observed that the offspring look pretty much like the parents, more or less like the parents, with some variation. So the inference is that these characteristics being inherited over generations and generation and generation, always keeping in mind the variation that happens from one generation to the next, could lead eventually to new species or variants becoming their own population. Yes. And I'm thinking out loud here with regards to Darwin, he would see species in a functional way as the individuals that belong to a particular population. So even though he did not have a formal biological definition of species, yet he would intuit that the individuals belonging to a particular population are what we would call the species today. Okay. And so populations can vary to the point that they can eventually generate new populations. New populations meaning that they will have their own characteristics, different from the original population they came from. Okay, now let me just give you a few examples of this. We'll go one by one, and if you have specific questions, this would be the time to act, because these 5 observations are the core, basically, of what led him over the years to the theory of evolution, okay, these 5 observations, which are the same 5 observations that we can make as we look at nature. So let's look at this overabundance of gametes and zygotes. And when I say zygotes, I also mean embryos. For example, here we're all at the embryonic stage. Well, no, the pollen is. Okay. All right, well, let's start with the pollen, which here, these are pine trees, and you can barely see these cones. These are cones, and this is a pine tree. In other words, it's a conifer. It's not a deciduous plant. It's not a flowering plant. Remember that pine trees, conifers, they have cones instead of flowers. They have needles instead of leaves, and they have resin instead of sap. Okay, these are all adaptations for the winter up north and the cold and so forth, so that they get to stay green throughout the winter, and that's why also they're called evergreen, and that's their advantage over the other plants, the deciduous plants that lose their leaves, because they can resist that cold weather to the point of water freezing, mostly because of the resin. They have a resin which is thick and very low content of water, in contrast to sap, which has high content of water and will slow down and become very sluggish and dormant, the sap, in the wintertime. Whereas the resin will continue to circulate even in low temperatures. It's kind of an antifreeze and allows the tree to continue to metabolize and grow, and that gives them the advantage, the evergreens, the conifers, over the other deciduous trees that drop their leaves and become dormant in the wintertime. Okay. But anyway, that's just a little background with regards to pine trees or conifers. The cone itself is the female reproductive organ of the pine tree, of the conifer. Okay, because inside each cone there will be eggs, ovules. So, cone. No. Fine cone. The other cone, the natural cone, not the artificial. Okay. See the noun? Will make a difference. Okay. So this is the female reproductive organ of the pine tree, because inside these are called scales. So they have scales instead of petals and so forth. At the base of each one of these scales, okay, deep within here at the stalk, at the center, at the core, will be an egg or an ovule that would match up to each scale in principle. It would be an egg in each scale. And so when the cone opens up like that, it is ready to accept the plant equivalent of sperm and semen, which is what? In plants, the equivalent of sperm is pollen grains, okay? In fact, each pollen grain actually has 2 sperm nuclei inside. They're microscopic. But basically, this is what we're seeing here. So this yellow cloud down here, this is pollen, all right? This is pollen that this pine tree is producing. Look at the billions, trillions, quadrillion pollen grains that are here in such density that one can actually see it with plain sight. Whereas here is a photograph, this is a micro photograph of pollen grains. They come in very different colors and sizes and shapes, but they're all microscopic. These are all different. This is a micro photograph of pollen grains, all right? For us to be able to see this cloud, there has to be quadrillion, gazillion pollen grains in there. Do you think that all those are needed to fertilize these cones? And these could probably fertilize most of the pine trees in the world. This one outlet of pollen, because there's so many. It's an overabundance. The vast majority of these pollen grains are not going to make it, not going to fertilize an egg. Okay, so what are they there for? Well, they're there to make our car look yellow when in the springtime when all this is coming out and cover everything with yellow. But some animals, turns out they feed on pollen. So animals actually feed on pollen, and then with some insects mostly, you look at them, they'll have their gut full of these pollen grains. Okay, so their food, and the ones that don't get eaten, they will rot and become part of the nutrition for the plant when they fall to the ground eventually and rot away. But you know, how many of these pollen grains does it take to replace the one tree that is producing all this pollen? How many fertilized eggs, how many zygotes does it take to replace the one tree? Well, it takes one zygote to replace. Here's a dandelion, right? So how many of these seeds, you see these seeds are airborne? Mm-hmm. How many of these seeds does it take to replace this one dandelion? Just one. Okay, and what are all these hundreds of seeds doing here? Well, they're going to disperse and fly all over the place. Look at this also in the mushroom world. In the mushroom world, I'm going to show you. This is now not pollen, but it's kind of the functional equivalent. These are spores. Okay, that is coming out of this puffball. This mushroom is called a puffball for obvious reasons. They puff up and they blow up and they disperse a huge amount of spores. Here's a micro photograph of the spores individually. This is actually exploding here. You can see the pieces of the mushroom flying out and this huge cloud. Again, gazillion of these spores. And how many of these spores does it take to replace this one mushroom? It's one of these. Okay, so the vast majority are just going to become food or rot away and become part of the organic material of the soil. The same for the progeny. Again, this whole cluster, we only needed one of those to replace the parent that produced them. On the animal side, more here. So we can see these are fish eggs. You can see little tiny fish inside, right, with the yolk sac. Yeah, the little yolk sac. Yes.
I have patients when they give birth.
Yeah.
They give like 40.
Yes.
But they're like dead or the egg is not mature. And
Yes.
only 2 of them survive.
Look at that.
It's impressive.
Yeah.
Wow.
You have
Yeah,
aquarium?
One are dead or without a tail.
Right.
Or the
Maybe
egg
defective.
not mature with only the
mature.
eye. And only 2 of them survive from 40.
Wow, amazing. So is this aquarium fish that you have?
Yeah, I
Okay.
have a fish tank,
Yeah,
and
fish
I
tank.
see when they give
Yeah,
birth,
when they give
like
birth.
40, but two
Yeah.
survive.
Fresh water? Fresh water?
Yeah, fresh water.
Yeah, are they guppies and
Yeah, they're
swordfish?
only
Guppies, right? Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But
So
it's impressive because there are a lot that they
exactly, and
don't
the
survive.
female is swollen with all the eggs, and right, and the female is larger, the male is smaller, and a fancy tail.
Overabundance is that.
There's an overabundance there, and it only takes two, like you say, to replace the parents. Again, this is a crab. This is a crab. The underside, the belly, you can see is, these are the fingers of the person who's holding the crab. That's the nail there, right? These are the fingers, see? They're holding the crab out like this. These are the eggs. These are the eggs. So this is definitely a female crab. These little brown things are her gills, right? These are the gills, because this is the abdomen of the crab, the underside. And these are all eggs. Okay, these are eggs. She holds them inside her pouch there. It's not a pouch, it's the abdomen. And she will vent them when they're in water. She will vent them up and down like this to aerate. But again, it only takes one of these little eggs to replace mom and another one to replace dad. And she's carrying around these thousands, millions of eggs. That becomes food even for us. That's raw, right? Raw or fish eggs or crab eggs. The shrimp also have that. Many, many animals. So I think the point is very well understood here, that because there's such high fertility, the vast majority of these organisms, of any organism, is not going to survive. Okay? So we get it. Now, that's at the beginning of the curve here. At the beginning of, this is known as a population growth curve, which has this typical shape, which is known as sigmoid shape, S shape. It's like a stretched out S. And it has three main regions. It has the rapid growth area at the beginning, which is called the exponential phase, because it's a doubling, essentially a doubling of the population. Increasingly, originally, there are plenty of resources because the number is small, population size is a small number. And then it goes into this geometric population growth, doubling the population at every generation until they start running out of resources. Start running out of resources because the resources are always limited. And so it starts leveling off. And that's the transitional phase until it comes to the plateau, and it will stay at that number. Now, this is the total number of individuals in the population, okay? But each individual will vary because individuals don't live forever. They die. And as they die, new ones are replacing them. So there is a turnover in the population. Turnover of individuals. Some individuals die, others come of age and replace the ones who are dying. But, excuse me, it stabilizes. And that stability there, that number of individuals in each particular population of the world is called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity. Okay. That carrying capacity tends to remain stable over time, unless there's some kind of drastic change.
In bacteria, I think we see that a lot.
Yes,
With the exponential.
exactly, exponential. And as they eat up all the resources, the nutrients that are in the Petri dish or whatever, then they start leveling off, okay? And then at the same time, what happens with bacteria in particular, let's say in a growth in a Petri dish, is that at the same time that they're metabolizing those nutrients, they're also producing toxins. They're going into the Petri dish. So that begins to kill them. And that's why they, over a period of time, they can overgrow the nutrients medium. and then they'll all start dying off. Okay, and then what you get is a lot of rotten bacteria. So you have to be careful with that. Mhm. But here's an example. Well, yeah. Oh, sorry, I think I've been touching. Yes. This one. Let's give it a minute. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Okay, so here we have a crab catching a baby turtle. So this turtle didn't make it, unfortunately. Yeah, many turtles, because again, it was one female that laid dozens of eggs. And we only need one baby turtle to replace the mom. But when they make it from the nest hole out to the shore, to the water, they're going to find either crabs or seagulls or other animals that will eat them. Or even when they get into the water, they have a better chance in the water for sure. But even a bunch of fish will be there waiting for them, and sharks and all kinds of creatures. Yeah. No, sea turtles have lost that ability because, yeah, they cannot retract only a little bit, but not that much really, because the fins have developed for swimming. And so they're swimming all the time, pretty much. And since because they are reptiles, they need to breathe. They have lungs, they don't have gills, so they need to go up to breathe and then down again. So sea turtles have lost their ability to retract into the shell, in contrast to the land turtles. Yeah.
So maybe they can lose their shell eventually, or not eventually.
It could be the shell could become more and more degenerate, but the shell has another characteristic, which is basically, as you can see here, it's an armor around the thorax, around the mid region of the body. Okay, so it still has function. It's so it hasn't been selected out. It hasn't become vestigial, but it has reduced to the point that it's more hydrodynamic, and it has less resistance to the water. So if you can think of a land turtle, it would be very awkward for swimming. It's not designed for swimming. Lighter? Well, it's more hydrodynamic. It's more long. It's more oblong. It offers less resistance to the water, right? Whereas a land turtle doesn't have to worry about that. Rather, the land turtle wants a hard shell where it can retract and also bury. They make holes and so forth. So, but this is just an example of how the population of turtles is being checked to stability. So the carrying capacity is not just running out of food, it can be also predators that limit and are taking out the weaker ones. For example, here we got a bunch of chimpanzees fighting with each other, and this is probably what is called an alpha male, right? They all look pretty robust, and there's dimorphism. So this is probably looks like at least 4 males fighting for territory for the female. This guy from the color looks like an older male that is being replaced by a younger alpha male, and he's even using a stick to chase him away as a weapon. Okay, interesting. Yeah. But the encounters, it's interesting that the encounter between animals, the males and the male fighting, which we'll see a little later in sexual selection, is typically not to death. Not to death. It's just right. It's to push the other male. The weaker male would then eventually walk away or run away, because if he persists and trying to fight a stronger male, then he's going to get hurt badly. Yeah. So yeah. So they typically walk away. It is a lot of posturing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the third observation is that the resources are limited. Here's a moose walking around in the winter time trying to find something to eat from the dormant trees. These are obviously not conifers. So if this moose were to go into a pine forest, a conifer, why would the moose not go for the pine needles that are green and are living? Because the pine needles are not good to eat. They're very crusty. They have resin, which is not easy to digest, right? And it will make the animal sick. So this moose is left to eating whatever is left of the little leaves and twigs, in contrast to eating green needles from the pine, because the pine has adapted to that it's not edible. Limited resources here. So the limited resources on this moose, which we assume belongs to a population, right? It's a population of meese, is the amount of food that they're going to find along the way. The limited resource, you can see this is a river. It's a relatively old river because it has a lot of meandering, okay? And you can see that on the outside of the river, it's pretty dry out here. But along the edge of the river, what we call the bank, the river bank, there is a lot of greenery, right? And trees and bushes and so forth. So it's very green right on the edge, the river bank. So what do you think is the big natural resource here that is maintaining the riverbank green and the rest of the land brown or gray? What is the most obvious natural resource? The water. The water. We can assume that these trees on the riverbank have plenty of water at the root level, but you just walk away a few feet from the riverbank and it's bone dry, no water. So this is probably very sandy terrain that the rain just drains right through, and it's not held. Or perhaps that it doesn't rain that much in this area. You can see some tributaries coming in here into the river. Okay, but anyway. And also, yeah, but well, there will be nutrients here, but the nutrients here are not dissolved in water, so they're not available for absorption, right? The nutrients have to be dissolved in water for the plant to absorb them. All right, another example here. What are these? Anybody know what these are? These are barnacles, right? They grow, barnacles are animals and they're sedentary. They grow figs typically on the ocean. They grow on rocks or a piece of log or something like that, okay? But here, what's the limited resource? The limited resource is the plastic bottle that was floating. Yes, exactly. So this plastic bottle was floating. We can assume, we cannot see the cap, but we can assume that the cap, we had a cap here, that it was closed, it was floating. And so these barnacles were growing on the bottom side, the side that was in the water, that was submerged in the water. So we can pretty much deduce that this part of the bottle up here was floating up out of the surface, okay? And this was below the surface and all these barnacles, but there's a limited number of barnacles that can grow on this bottom, which is a limited, the foothold is a resource here because they're sedentary. Here, what do we have? We have vultures that are eating on a carcass. So this carcass is going to run out at some point. There's a limited amount of food for these vultures to feed on. So that's the whole point of limited resources. So these guys are competing against each other. And guess what? The stronger, the stronger vulture will get the lion's share out of the carcass, will get the main piece of the carcass. These, exactly, you can contrast these. Look at the necks. Look at the neck of this fellow and the neck of this fellow and the coloration and the plumage, the feathers and so forth. If one of them was an adult and another one a juvenile, including this one here, which one do you think is the adult and which is the juvenile? With more or less color? This one you say is a juvenile? No, it's actually backwards. Even the size, you can see the size of the wings, okay? But what you can tell is this is the adult, and it's probably adult male with all this coloration and missing feathers at the, underneath the beak, on the neck, and the spotting around the eye and so forth. And look how developed the beak is compared to, this is a juvenile, And this is a juvenile. Can you see where I'm pointing? Yeah, oh, it's way over here.
The adult is also using wings to like
To threaten, and it's flaring out. Look at the feathers he has out here. So it's really flaring out, and it's probably screaming. Look at this other guy here also looks pretty, this is what the juveniles are seeing. And so the juveniles are waiting, staying away. In fact, this one is actually off the ground. It's backing off. I don't know if you can see it. It's backing off from the carcass because the adults are going to have their share first, the stronger ones, and then eventually something will be left for the juveniles to come when these guys get satiated, right? Okay, so limited resources for sure. They put on pressure for competition. Next is the one on variety. We've talked about this point so much. Here is a variety of spots on the giraffe, which is a single species, and yet you can see the variety of spots and colors, the pattern, the color, the shape, even the shape of the animal, but mostly the pattern, all right? Great variety there. Faces in the human is very obvious, the variety of faces that we have at particular ages. These snails, also all the same species. Look at that, the pattern. Yes, isn't it? These are lilies, white, purple, and a mixture, a hybrid in between, the white and the purple. Okay. And these, look at this. These are also lilies. This is a photo during daytime with just sunlight. This is an infrared photo. This one here is an infrared photo. You see the pattern that we don't see with natural light? It's an infrared pattern. Look at that. So it's estimated that some insects in particular, the pollinators and the ones that come for nectar and so forth, can detect infrared coloring, this pattern. And this is the pattern that is attracting them. Interesting, yeah. Because without the machine, so we say the visible spectrum, but yeah, it's a visible spectrum for us. But other species will have somewhat different visible spectrum. And they have a broader. Many animals don't really see color, or they only see a few colors. Okay, finally, this is the issue about speciation, right? So this is kind of the bottom line. Look at this. This is just one example of cichlids. You have for sure aquarium, you know they're very precious. The cichlids are, some are very rare, and others are more common. They tend to be very territorial and aggressive, so you can only have, no, right, they'll destroy everything else. They're very, very, very territorial. Yes, they have tremendous patterns. Look at, it's estimated there are about 400 different species of cichlids in Lake Victoria, in the Lake Victoria region, which is here, East Africa. All right, these are the lakes. This is Victoria, and then Lake Tanganyika, and Lake Malawi, depending on the countries that they're falling in. And it is estimated that there was a huge drought in Africa around 17,000 years ago. And these lakes became dry, all right? So dry means no fish. Maybe fish eggs that somehow survived the drought. They were maybe embedded in the mud somehow. But this Lake Victoria was dry 7,000 years ago, 17,000 years. And today, and then about 3,000 years later, all right, so stay dry for about 3,000 years. Stay dry for about 3,000 years. And now we have about 400 species of cichlids in these lakes. Where they come from? They had to come from common ancestor, and that's what this is indicating. These phylogenetic trees that you're familiar with now. Okay, look at the great variety of shapes and colors and patterns. They're all cichlids, right? Different, but different species. So in 3,000 years, sorry, in 14,000 years, evolution has occurred here, big time, which is amazing. All the hybridization.
It was like an extinction, right?
Yes, it could have been like a mass extinction of the previous cichlids that were there, and then they radiated. Exactly. So this is a very good example of radiation. And I mean, it's nothing. 14,000 years in geologic time is very little. The last ice age was about 10,000 years ago. So it's very, very recent. You can see the phylogenetic tree here of the whole gamut of cichlids. Okay? It's amazing. So it does happen. Now let's get a little bit into the niche. Or habitat. It's either continuous or discontinuous, right? Depending on the flow and how close the next population is. So again, thinking functionally, a niche is the role that an organism has in nature. And therefore, it's also, associated with a place, with a geography. And that's what we call the habitat. So niche and habitat go together. You can see here, there are, four different, there are four different species here, shown in this photograph. Can you distinguish them? Give a hint. One of the species is dead. Yeah, that zebra got taken down by the lioness. So that's the behavior. What's the behavior of the lion? Predator. Okay, so that's their niche. Hunt down. The zebra this one was a herbivore. So their niche was grazing on the prairie. But then you notice, again, here are the vultures, the African vultures, right? Trying to come in. But did the vultures hunt down the zebra? No, so they're not predators as such. But they're opportunistic. They're trying to catch a bite. They're carnivores, right? So they are scavengers. They feed on the carrion. Carroña, right? Carrion. So they are scavengers. And then there's this other little fellow here that you think maybe it's a lion pup. That's actually a hyena. Okay, it's a hyena. Now you can tell, you see the spots, and the muzzle is very different from the lion muzzle. It's black muzzle. Okay, but this is a hyena, and the hyena is also waiting. It's a scavenger. Sometimes hyenas can hunt, but they are not as good as the lion hunting. So they stick around and wait until the lion has had her share, walked away, and then they come in. So that's the niche. Each one in this prairie, this savanna, each animal has a niche. Continuous meaning that individuals will migrate in and out of adjacent populations. So these little guys are called aphids. This is the head region here. These are antennas on the top. And then this is a thorax in the middle and the abdomen in the back. What aphids do is they puncture through the plants and they suck out some of the sap, and they can infect the plant also as they do that, just like a mosquito can infect us and other mammals. Okay, these are aphids and they grow in colonies. So here's one population of aphids on this little twig. Here's another population of aphids on this other little twig. There will be variants within each one of these populations. but because they're so close to each other and they don't move around much, but they tend to stick around on the twigs. Sometimes you can see them in plants that are infected by these guys. And there will be some migration of some aphids from one population to the other. As you can see here, this guy is moving this way. There's a little one here moving. So there's another one here moving in the opposite direction. So there's some migration between populations, but mostly the populations stay distinct, all right? So it's a flow. And what kind of flow? Gene flow, because again, functionally, biologists and geneticists will see this aphid here as a bag of genes. Functionally, it's carrying the aphid genes. And as this aphid moves from this population to this population, it's bringing its own genes into this other population. And if it mates and so forth, it will pass on those genes, whatever trait he or she had, to this other population over here instead of here, okay, or in addition to here. So the genes are flowing from one population to the other, all right? So this is a small scale because these are adjacent twigs within a bush, and maybe these populations of aphids will stay their whole lifetime in this one little bush, small size, very localized. Other niches and habitats are discontinuous, okay, when they have a large separation between them. It could be an ocean in between them, or it could be a mountain range or something like that. So we see here, these are monkeys, and this is they're known here, if this is North America, or I'm sorry, South America, this would be, this looks like a little capuchin monkey, maybe from South America, cappuccino. They're called New World monkeys. New World monkeys is in Latin America, all right? And in Africa and India, they're called Old World monkeys, Old World. So New World and Old World monkeys are separated by an entire ocean, and therefore there is divergence, big time divergence in the population. Excuse me. And that's why you can see there's a lot of variation. Okay, these are actually different species, but still they're monkeys. So there's some grouping between them. This also happens in plants for sure, and it also happens in lichens, which are a combination of algae and fungi. The fungi provides the foothold, typically on rock, or it could be on soil. And then the algae provides the photosynthetic pigments for photosynthesis. And the combination of these two, of algae and fungi, form what we call lichens. And lichens will grow in rock, it will grow sometimes a little bit on sand, mostly rock. And they're pioneers because lichens, in their metabolism, produce acid. As most rocks are basic or alkaline, the acid will start dissolving the rock little by little. And so that adds to the soil, those minerals that went into the soil and will enrich the soil over a long period of time. And so you can see that this niche is very localized, very sedentary, if you will. Most likely this lichen this patch will stay there all of its lifetime, will spread very slowly around the edge, and at some point these rocks may become totally covered by lichens. Here's some evidence of an older lichen that may be dried out and left a mark on the stone, on the rock. All right, so we understand niche and habitat. Let's move now to the selection that is a selecting out, right? It's a process of elimination. And on average, the ones that get selected out are the less fit, on average, the less fit. So it's a statistical here. We have to be shifting back and forth forever between the deterministic and probabilistic. For example, There are two main species that are illustrated here, right? What do we have? The grizzly bear and this fish, probably a salmon, maybe a trout, probably a salmon. Okay, and they got 3 hungry mouths waiting for that fish. Mm-hmm. So, but you notice of these 3 bears, one is best positioned to catch the salmon, which is this guy out here. But he's right at the edge of that waterfall. If he loses that grip, he's going to go over the waterfall. And who knows what's down there? You could probably survive it with all that padding, but who knows? Maybe breaks a leg or a toe will then make him handicapped and will not be as good, could get infected. Even if he doesn't die from the fall, something could happen, could break a toe, then that will be a disadvantage, all right, for selection. So it's always acting on the weakest, but on average, meaning that this particular salmon could be one of the strongest salmon in that whole school of salmons that is migrating upriver, but the salmon just happened to jump at the wrong place, mainly at the wrong time, happened to jump into the mouth of the grizzly bear. Then this grizzly bear got the salmon, satisfied, walked away. In the meantime, another salmon jumped. Maybe the other salmon was not as strong as this one, but was lucky that the bear had walked away. Exactly. So you see, there's a lot of chance involved here. All right. So that's why that aspect I like of Meyer, at least he recognizes that there is determinism and chance. So we move from a deterministic model to probabilistic back and forth. Because these 3 bears and this one salmon on this photograph, they're not probabilities. These are determined bears. These are 3 specific determined bears that were there when the photo was taken. And so was the salmon. And this bear up front is not the bear in the back, and the bear in the back is not the bear in this other side here. So these are 3 specifically determined bears that were there at the time of the photo. They're not probabilities. See what I'm saying? Okay. Now the probability that this salmon may be caught or not is still a probability, still a chance until that actually happens. Once it happens, then the salmon was either caught or not. But until it happens, it's a probability. All right, now we need to look at selection, what is known as pre-zygotic and post-zygotic selection, okay? Because selection is a 2-step process. Again, breaking it down, we use this for the sake of illustration and for the sake of understanding. Nature doesn't know, of course, that it is selecting pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. But this is what is happening when we break it down. There is pre-zygotic selection is everything that happens up to fertilization, okay? Everything that needs to happen up to fertilization. That is called pre-zygotic. And it involves first meiosis, which is represented here, which occurs, meiosis is kind of generic for the actual process of producing the gametes that we call gametogenesis, right? And the end result of gametogenesis is fertilization, is the possibility of fertilization. But there could have been selection at any point here. There could have been selection during gametogenesis. There could have been selection during fertilization itself so that it didn't happen or it didn't happen correctly. So there's a lot of selective pressure on the egg and the sperm. I wanted to mention one selective pressure that is on the sperm, huge, immense, right? Because again, to fertilize, how many eggs are necessary to have one individual, say one individual human or one individual mammal? Only one egg to be mature to be fertilized. But functionally, again, functionally, okay, not an in vitro process or something like that that is done artificially. but just the way it happens in nature. For a man to be considered potent or competent or able to fertilize functionally, biologically, all right? That man needs to produce in his sperm needs to have what we call a sperm count from 100 to 150 million sperm for the sperm to be considered competent or potent or capable of fertilizing naturally, all right? Let's round it off to the lower number of 100 million in every ejaculate. So you can see that the selective pressure against sperm is immense. It's essentially 100 billion to 1, because it's only going to take one of those sperm to fertilize that egg. So what can we say? We can say that on average, the one sperm that does fertilize the egg, because of all the swimming it had to do and so forth, on average, that sperm is going to be the strongest, most capable, most vigorous, most potent sperm on average, right? And that's why when we're born, most of us are more on the normal, natural side, on the normal side, because the abnormals never made it. The abnormal sperm never made it. And that's another reason why it is such a bad news to do in vitro fertilization, because we're bypassing natural selection. And that sperm that was artificially combined in the lab, in a petri dish or a bottle with the egg, is not necessarily the most vigorous sperm. All right?
But we can consider that artificial selection.
Absolutely, it's artificial selection. And it's big time, because now they're selecting even more.
Basically.
Yes, we're choosing, the technician chooses a sperm that to him or her looks most capable. If it has a flagellum, a tail that more or less looks normal, it's wiggling and so forth. But that's very crass compared to the biochemical selection that occurs, very sophisticated along the whole female tract, how this sperm is wiggling, is swimming against the flow of mucus and everything else. It's very, very, we could never imitate the sophistication of selective pressure that occurs on sperm naturally. We could never imitate that on the lab, because the level of sophistication is beyond imagination. You know, so bewildering. It's really literally down to the biochemical level.
What if a couple has like a sterilization? They want a baby, do you think that it's better for them to adopt or instead of doing vitro?
Absolutely, 100%. In vitro is very bad news. We're going to talk about in vitro actually at length when we get into the next course in the spring. We'll look at the beginning of life issues, okay? So, but a lot of issues there that are really very, very negative. We'll get to it, we'll get to it. Okay, so my point here was that there's a lot of selection going on before the zygote, before one gets to the zygote, understanding that the zygote is a fertilized egg, okay? In general, all that selection that is going on from the precursor cells that are either in the ovaries, inside the follicle, or in the sperm, in the testicles, in the seminal vesicles, right, where the sperm is produced, all the way from that step to the actual fertilization, there is selection going on all the time, right? That selection is called prezygotic because it occurs before the zygote was actually the new individual. So the new individual is like a watershed. And it's typically microscopic down at the cellular level, at the chromosomal level. You can see, for example, an abiotic factor would be exposure to X-rays, either on the woman or on the man, which would cause mutations, could cause mutations, and will affect. All that would be prezygotic. And typically, it's microscopic. Now, what happens? Selection doesn't stop there. It's very strong to get to the zygote, but then selection continues. From the zygote forward, okay, the zygote has to go now through the embryonic stage to reach adulthood. And again, we're defining adulthood in biological terms, which is when the sexual reproductive organs become mature, capable of producing egg and sperm. All right. So imagine let's stick with the human for now. We have to go for 9 months from the zygote to when the baby is born. First of all, that's 9 months in the womb. There's selection going on there. In other words, if the mother is not careful with that pregnancy, she could lose the pregnancy, even if she's careful. If it was a weak, somehow of a weak genes, she may still lose the pregnancy, spontaneous abortion, and miscarriage, right? Then this baby needs to grow at least to the teen years when the sexual organs are mature, and typically older than that, and find a mate and actually be fertile to produce an offspring. So there is selection going on. There's big time selection in choosing a mate in humans, right? A lot. Spend years, and there are all kinds of industries. The cosmetic industry spends billions of dollars or receives billions of dollars for this issue here. The music industry for dancing and all that. I mean, you can name it. There's big time selection occurring in humans, just like in every other species out there. Huh? We don't like to admit it, but it's there. Then, necessary to find a couple, all right, but not sufficient. The couple also needs to be fertile to produce the offspring, to have the baby, all right? And that is from generation to generation to generation. So there is selection going on at all times here. Here we have 3 generations, but maybe the 3rd generation, one of them is infertile. We don't know. They don't know either until they find out. Okay? And so here, post-zygotic selection is multiple, but it has to do with embryonic development. It has to do with surviving to adulthood, defined in reproductive terms, in terms of being capable of reproducing. It has to do with actually finding a mate is not sufficient to be fertile. I actually need to land the mate, before I can express that fertility. And the mate also needs to be fertile. And our offspring also need to be fertile if we expect to pass on the genes to the future generation. So there is selection happening all along here, right? Post-zygotic. And so this one, we can say it starts microscopic at the embryonic level, but pretty soon it becomes macroscopic. In other words, it becomes large. We can see it. But selection is still going on. All right. Let's move forward now. Let's get into this concept of competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion. Again, always within the framework of the competition, right? Because that's how selective pressure is a competitive pressure. There is this principle of competitive exclusion that has been verified many, many times. Essentially, it says that 2 different species that are competing for the same resources, they cannot inhabit the same niche. Okay, they cannot inhabit the same niche. I like this definition because it includes both niche and habit. Right? So you think about it, it makes sense. You have 2 different species that are competing for the same resources. They cannot inhabit the same niche. At some point, there's going to be a differentiation of niches, okay? And this is what is known as niche exploitation, niche availability, and resourcing. So here's a little sequence where we have originally these yellow birds. Yellow birds landed on a tree, and they like the black bugs. So the yellow birds are eating black bugs on the trunk and on the canopy. Okay? And so these yellow birds are very happy because they got black bugs to eat on the trunk and on the canopy. But then along comes another flock of redbirds. And you know what they like? They like the black bugs. So that's the same resource, see? The same resource. What happens? I don't know if you can tell because it's not that obvious, but look at the size of the redbirds and look at the size of the yellowbirds. Now, when I mention size, you can see that some of the, there's variety of sizes within the birds, within the yellowbirds, and there's variety of sizes within the redbirds, but in general, the redbirds are a little bigger, right? A little bigger. Well, you know what they did? They displaced the yellowbirds because there was more black bugs on the trunk. So the redbirds took over the trunk and displaced and replaced the yellowbirds. The yellowbirds had to go to the canopy of the tree where there are fewer bugs and they have to struggle more. They were replaced. And that's what it means. The two different species, yellow and red, competing for the same resource, black bugs, cannot inhabit the same niche. They cannot all, both species have the whole tree. Okay? Sometimes it's subtle. In fact, you notice here by these redbirds coming in, it actually subdivided this population of, originally it was one continuous population here, all the way from the canopy through the trunk to the ground of yellowbirds. And now, when these redbirds are coming in to mostly the trunk region, they split the population. Some yellowbirds went to the canopy, and some yellowbirds decided to stay on the ground. That could eventually lead to speciation, because different, functionally, different skills are needed to navigate through the canopy than to navigate through the ground. So this may lead to speciation. For example, there could be a selective advantage for having longer legs down here, whereas a selective advantage to having longer or stronger wings up here at the canopy. You see? And so the canopy, just say, may be selecting for stronger wings, the ground may be selecting for longer legs, different characteristics. Emma? Yeah, please go ahead, Emma. Yeah, we're going to take a break in a minute. So this happens at all levels of plants and animals, right? And the fungi, the microscopic organisms also, at all levels. Let's see, at some point here we can take a break. Okay, so when we do this, we can break here. It's already 11:20. We're going for an hour and a half. Let's take a break here and come back. Then we'll look at what selection acts on, right? Primarily, it's going to be the individual, and then other different layers, and then we'll go into sexual selection. So let's take a break here. It's actually the flip of the page. Yeah. All right. That's providential. So I'm going to stop the recording temporarily. Okay, Giselle, I'm going to go and pause here. Okay, welcome back. Excuse me. Welcome back, everyone. We'll go into the second half of the lecture today. And we can ask the question, what does selection act upon, right? So this is not an invisible hand that is out there that is going to select indiscriminately here and there. There's no magic involved here. We have to always think of it functionally in nature, how it's happening. So we can ask the question, well, this selective pressure, if we see selection as a pressure, again, natural selection, okay, before we talk about sexual selection, what is this selection acting upon, right? What is the pressure upon? Well, the first object of selection, if you will, is going to be the phenotype. The phenotype, in other words, the expressed or observed characteristic of an individual. So that's the first object of selection. In other words, where does selection act? It acts on the phenotype. And the phenotype at the four different levels that we saw. What are those four levels? Morphological, physiological, molecular, and behavioral. Okay. For example, behavioral, the faster lion will catch the slower zebra on average. Okay. And that behavior is backed up with a particular morphology, a particular physiology, and so forth. So it's the phenotype of the individual. And this occurs across all three domains. This occurs with bacteria, with fungi, with plants, animals, archaea, across the board. So it can be seen that the phenotype, right, the expressed or observed characteristic, is either stable or evolvable. This is over long periods of time, generally relatively long period of time. We see that certain phenotypes become stable. For example, these are structures typically that have lasted for millions of years, essentially unchanged, which, for example, the nucleus in eukaryotes. A eukaryote can be small and simple as an amoeba, which has a nucleus, or it could be as complicated as animal tissue, let's say skin tissue, okay, or neuron, which is the most sophisticated tissue and specialized tissue that we have in the animal kingdom. And we see that both amoebas and neurons, they have nucleus where they store the DNA. So that structure, all right, that morphology of the nucleus has become stable, evolutionarily stable. In other words, it works. And nature has this, we attribute things to nature. Nature, if it works, it doesn't fix it. Okay. So the nucleus is working. The nucleus has a fantastic, spectacular function of protecting the DNA, which is so delicate and susceptible to mutations and so forth. So the nucleus does such a good function that we can find it across the board in all eukaryotes. And precisely, it's the Spartiaqua, is the one that splits the waters between the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. The one characteristic that is needed to be a eukaryote is to have a nucleus, you know, but it's at the level of domain. So we can see that that particular structure has become very stable over millions of years, and it's pretty fixed, we can say. Other structures, other phenotypes are evolvable. Many, many phenotypes are evolvable, okay? And these are the ones that selection is putting pressure on. So for example, the whole concept of legs, in other words, to move, different animals, different organisms have coped with that in different ways. So something as simple as what is known as a muscular foot on clams and mollusks in general. Mollusks are seashells, clams, conchs, all of these, mostly marine, freshwater also. They're aquatic creatures that have soft tissue, soft body inside with some kind of a shell on the outside. Most of them have this foot-like appendage that can stick out and can be retracted into the shell or into the conch, and it's called a muscular foot, and is used for walking, kind of crawling at the bottom, somewhat limited, and it also allows the individual to bury into the sand. Okay? Different, the echinoderms, in other words, the starfish, sea urchins, and brittle stars, sea cucumbers is another type of echinoderm. They have evolved a different type of foot for walking. It's called a tube feet. First of all, there are many tube feet, and it's part of what is known as the water vascular system. In other words, inside the starfish, inside the sea urchin, there's a whole network of tubes that take on water, and that's how they manage to walk around. And so they're called tube feet. I got one too many teeth here. All right. Yeah. Looked funny to me. I couldn't tell what it was because so many little sticks look alike. The F, the E, and the T. All right. So tube feet is another adaptation. These can be considered relatively simple legs, even though the tube feet mechanism, the water vascular system that is called water vascular system, is more sophisticated than the muscular foot of mollusks. That makes echinoderms more sophisticated in general than mollusks. They're not articulated as such, but when we get to the insects and the arthropods in general, the feet are articulated now. They have articulated legs, all right? Because they have an exoskeleton. And these are the most sophisticated of the invertebrates, what we call arthropods. And in fact, the whole classification of the phylum arthropod is based on the fact that they have articulated legs, because pod is something that sticks out, a leg, and arthro is articulation. So arthropod actually means in Greek or Latin articulated legs. And they are the insects, the crustaceans, beetles, flies, butterflies, crabs, shrimp, lobster, you name it. All of these that have an exoskeleton, like anything that crunches, like the cockroach, right? They have articulated legs. And they have become very, very sophisticated and adapted. And here's a further adaptation. Anyone recognize what this creature is? Mantis, praying mantis, the praying mantis, right? And they're insects, they're part of the insecta class. And insects typically have 6 legs. But you notice that the front legs of the mantis have adapted further to walking a little bit, but they're used mostly for hunting and for catching prey. So they catch prey. It's kind of, this is the catching area here. Is like a pair of pliers almost. And they're very good at it. So they are voracious predators, the praying mantis. And they also adapt highly. It's amazing. Mantis is a beautiful animal that adapts very well to the environment.
Have the ability to camouflage?
Yes, exactly. That's what I was looking for, camouflage. Correct. Let's look at some praying mantis here. They have many different shapes and colors. Some are exotic, very exotic. One time at St. Vincent de Paul Seminary up in Boynton Beach in West Palm Beach, we have also the Australian, not the slash pine, the real slash pine. And I saw some mantis there that were totally camouflaged to the bark of the pine tree. Now, that must have taken some time to do, but they can adapt very, very well. They're great hunters, but beside that, see, most of these are green, but some are very different colors. Okay, so here's one that's brown. Yeah. Yeah, you can see they pull out, this is the front legs, they're very well adapted for hunting. Yes, very voracious, very voracious. Look at that beauty. Easy. Look at this one.
lifespan on it?
I don't know, but they tend to be short. Insects typically are short. They may vary from species to species also, all right? These are different species of the whole group of mantis. But some mimic a flower so well. Look at that. Like a little orchid or a lily, but it's actually a mantis.
When I was a kid, I used to have a terrarium.
Yes.
I caught one.
You caught?
She ate everything, the butterflies, the gas wrappers, and I was,
Oh, yeah.
of course, I didn't know what was happening.
Right.
But she took like the butterflies, like a piece of meat,
Uh-huh.
and it was so.
Right. They're voracious. They're
I had to
incredibly.
set her free because she was eating it.
Yeah. Yeah. So where did you catch it?
In my garden.
Just a garden. You saw it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, in Venezuela. I used to
In Venezuela.
Uh-huh.
What color was it?
It was green.
Green. Yeah. It's the most prevalent color is green. But look at this. This one looks like what?
Scorpion. Yeah.
Looks like a scorpion. Looks like an ant. Right. It's very rare. It's amazing. Big. Yeah. This is called the abdomen, and even these adaptations here on the head. It's just incredible. They adapt.
I think that after they mate, the female eats the male, something like that.
Yes,
right?
and sometimes even as they're mating. Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think that's bizarre.
It's called the mating dance of the mantis. It's a deadly.
The mating rate.
It's yeah, it's deadly because the female typically is very large compared to the male. Okay, talk about mating. Here we go. So this is a female, right? Has a large abdomen because it's full of eggs inside, and the male will come and mount her and start copulating, and at some point, even halfway through the copulation, the female will turn around and grab him and eat him. Yeah. You'll start from the head. She'll start from the head down, and so it's a fatal mate. Mhm. But if it achieves the purpose, right? In other words, if this male managed to fertilize the female, then his mission was accomplished because he grew to reproductive age and actually made it. Right? So he'll pass on his genes. Cost him his life, but the idea in nature is to pass on the genes, right?
But is that selection? No.
Yes, but this is sexual selection.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now, and in fact, this is a combination of sexual selection and natural selection, because the more successful male, meaning the one who got to mate, will also be the one to get eaten. So that means that on average, you'll only have one chance to mate. You'll have one mating opportunity. Exactly. But
Mantis sex and cannibalism.
and cannibalism, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Just one chance to reproduce. So he was successful, assuming that his sperm was fertile and all that. But at least at the macroscopic level, what we can see, he was successful. Very well. The coloration. They do. They can fly. Yeah, they're not that good at flyers. Actually, generally they prefer to crawl around. But they can fly also. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyway, that was the mantis. You can see that the front legs are very articulated and additionally adapted beyond crawling and walking for catching prey. Secondarily, the second object of selection, it doesn't just stop with the phenotype of the individual, it goes beyond. It is also on the gametes, okay? But think of it this way. Why wouldn't the gametes be a primary object of selection? Because the gametes have to be on an individual to begin with. They're produced by the individual. So before the gametes are even produced, that individual already went through post-zygotic selection. And that's why really gametes, this struck me at first. I said, well, why aren't the gametes at the first level? It's because the gametes in nature have to be produced by some individual. And that individual to produce gametes should have, has to be able to make it from the zygote all the way to reproductive age. And there's selection going on there. So that's the primary selection. In other words, the primary selection really is post-zygotic. And the individual that gets to mature and produce potent gametes, then secondarily, selection can also act on those gametes. But you need the individual to produce the gametes to begin with. Otherwise, there's not going to be any selection done. So that's why gametes are secondary objects of selection. But also, as we expand, there are times that entire groups are subject to selection, all right? For example, when we saw the red birds displacing the yellow birds, that whole flock of birds, of yellow birds, was being displaced. So that's group selection. In other words, it's not at the individual level. You see, it's not the individual phenotype, it's the group phenotype. The yellow birds got displaced by the red birds as a group. This could be, in that case, it was biotic factors that did the pressure, the selective pressure, but it could have been abiotic factors, for example, a change in climate or weather. There's also kin selection. Kin selection is within the family members. Sometimes that happens. There's a preference for males or females or for the young or the old, whatever. Typically on the litter, the youngest one gets to be left behind and they have more difficulty in surviving because they were the last in the litter. This is for animals, for mammals, for example, that produce several offspring in a single litter, right? So there can be some kin selection going on. There's some preference for some member of the family. Typically are the firstborns have preference because, again, limited resources. It can happen sometimes with birds as they're chirping, the baby birds are asking, the chicks are asking for food, all right? The bigger one gets fed more, so it synergizes and gets bigger still and eventually displaces the sibling, may even physically push them out of the nest when they get big enough. Also, interspecies selection, where you have, well, again, two species competing for the same resources. One species, one population will displace the other one. This is a big to-do with exotic plants and animals, and we have some examples here in Miami. On the animal side, we have the iguanas, for example, which were introduced, and now they're all over the place. And they're slowly but surely replacing the niche of other animals that would have exploited that niche. It could be small mice, or it could be other native lizards. We also have it with plants. Plants in particular is a big problem because when invasive or exotic plants are introduced to an area, typically they don't have the natural predators or the checkpoints that they have in their own native places. So I'm thinking of 2 or 3 plants in particular that have become very invasive in the area of South Florida. From Australia, there is the casuarina, which is the Australian pine, which is not a pine at all. It's actually a deciduous tree that has adapted by what is known as convergent evolution to look like a pine, but it's not a pine. Anyway, the Australian pine tends to form a monoculture because they're dropping their little leaves, needle-like leaves. They're dropping these leaves all the time, and they create a mat on the ground and doesn't allow anything else to grow but their own seedlings and their own offshoots. Okay? And so they cause what is known as a monoculture. They take over an area and they tend to displace the local population, the native plants. They grow faster, they don't have insects that eat them up and keep them in check. So that's for the Australian pine. Also, another one is the Melaleuca, which is also known as the paper tree, paper bark. That's out in the Everglades. Melaleuca has a bark that looks, it peels off, similar, looks a little bit like rough paper. Melaleuca. Yes, it puts out a flower that is either whitish or reddish, and when they're in bloom, it smells a little bit like smells a little bit like potato. They get chopped up and they regrow.
There's also
Yeah.
an aquatic plant.
Yes,
I don't remember the name.
seaweed.
Seaweed that they just
Mhm.
cover all the lakes.
Yes,
They
exactly.
take over
Yes, yes. They're
and they grow.
yes.
They're not seaweed, they're
It's not a seaweed. Yes, it's hydranthea. Okay, but and
all the animals cannot eat it.
exactly, it takes over. Yes, they grow very fast and they don't have any native enemies. Mhm.
It's a competition for space, not for nature.
Exactly. Mhm. And anyway, also the Brazilian pepper tree is another one. The Brazilian pepper tree. We have a lot of invasives in South Florida, including the pythons that are in the Everglades. This is the Brazilian pepper tree. It grows very large. It's actually a bush. It puts out this little red flowers, this red beads, but it grows very bushy and it's highly invasive. We have some in the forest here. So these are all species that are exotic. They tend to take over an area and they don't have natural enemies. So they displace the local population, the natural population, which is more slow growing and so forth. And finally, at the biggest level is the clad selection, clad or clade, depending if you're American or British. Some say potatoes, some say potato, clad or clade. It is, this is when there is some kind of a drastic climatological change, some kind of a catastrophe that will lead to the extinction of an entire group of animals or plants. Okay, so an entire clade is a large group of similar organisms. For example, famously the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs can be considered a clade, and that was caused by some kind of a phenomenon. That was a drastic change in the environment. So this is secondarily beyond the individual level, and again at the levels. So the individual level, the phenotype, at the level of morphology, physiology, molecular, and behavior. The last question on in general, on natural selection. Natural selection, why in general is so slow? In general, well, we're finding out that it's not as slow as we thought. For example, the example I gave you with the cichlids in Africa, but generally it is slow, and it's simply because when we look out the window again, the vast majority of organisms that we see out there are already adapted. They're well adapted to this particular environment, to this particular climate. So why would they change? You know, unless there's some kind of drastic change in the environment, they're adapted. So they're just reacting to the selective pressure mostly of limited resources and things like that. But they're already well adapted to the current environment. And again, the vast majority of species on the other side of this wall have reached a plateau of the carrying capacity for each environment, for each niche. And so there's just replacement of the old with the young. They are at their stable carrying capacity in nature. However, we do see some evolution going on if we, mostly at the microscopic level, if we pay attention. And the example I had here was what is called the superbugs. Okay, what are the superbugs? Right. Superbugs in medicine and in hospitals are these bacteria that have become resistant to a broad range of antibiotics. They're called superbugs, and they're extremely dangerous because essentially no antibiotic kills them, or very few. Okay, so they become immune to an increasing number of antibiotics. That's why it's always a big contention now, controversial topic for a doctor when to give antibiotics, because from the public health perspective, public health systems would have doctors give no antibiotics or very little, because what's happening is that our bacteria that we carry around all the time become immune. So it will kill the vast majority of bacteria when I take the antibiotics, but a few may survive. If those few that survive get eventually to thrive, they're now immune to that antibiotic that I took. So that antibiotic is useless, right? And we're finding that these superbugs are lodging themselves mostly in hospital systems, like in the vents of air conditioning and things like that, all right? And so there is a big concern for them because they can contaminate. You notice also that hospitals today, they don't want you staying long periods of time in the hospital. They want to get you out. Even, I mean, it's amazing with heart surgery, the next day they have you up walking around within 24 hours. It's very aggressive therapy and rehabilitation to get you out of the hospital. If they can get you out in 2-3 days, they'll discharge you because they're afraid that the superbugs, which they know are there, will get an infection like MRSA and these other ones. And it's a big problem because they don't have antibiotic that will kill them. Okay? They have become.
So we can say it's an artificial selection because we are inducing the use of antibiotics to the development of this superbug.
It's true. It's a good point that it is artificial selection. However, it's not being done on purpose. In other words, it's a side effect. Okay? It's definitely selection, but whether it's artificial, well, it's a side effect of trying to cure the person. It's not intentional. Exactly. So, but it is artificial in the sense that the bacteria are reacting to the antibiotics that we're generating. Yeah. The whole department's a very important department in a hospital is infection control, but internal of the hospital, not infection control of the people coming in with infections, but the internal infection control of the hospital itself, so that the units, the different units of the hospital, do not come contaminated with these superbugs. All right, because then they have a big problem. They have to evacuate the hospital, they have to shut it down, put it in quarantine, and that's a huge mess, and it would cost millions and millions. So this issue of the superbugs, we're actually seeing evolution going on, in relatively short period of time. Okay, let's move on now to sexual selection, which, like I mentioned earlier, natural selection involves random mating. So strictly speaking, it's not that, in other words, there are forces that act on the individual, on the phenotype, that are not mating forces. Okay? In addition to natural selection that is occurring out there all the time, there's also sexual selection. But the big difference with sexual selection is that there is a mate choice. So it's non-random. It's non-random. And the typical pattern is that there will be male competition for vigor, and the female chooses the male. That's the standard. Sometimes it's backwards, but the most majority of cases, this is the standard. So we can see, for example, that is going to create or generate some differences, again, at the 4 levels of the morphology, physiology, biochemical, molecular, and then also on the behavior. One of the big differences at the morphological level, and therefore physiological, is called sexual dimorphism. Okay. Morphism, morph, is a shape or form, morph, and di meaning two shapes. So for many species, many groups show dimorphism. Some is drastic dimorphism, as for example in the gorillas. This is the male and the female is much smaller. So you can see that there's a lot of selective pressure on the male to become bigger and stronger and bigger and stronger. And they have their fights and their show and so forth. And the female is just sitting in the background, selecting to see who's going to win from these two guys that are fighting it out. Okay. Like I say, a lot of it is show. They'll huff and puff and yell and scream around and beat their chest, but rarely is there actual contact. Sometimes there is contact, but the contact is, again, for strength or vigor. For example, when deer lock horn and so forth, or even just the size of the antler. Sometimes the female is larger, as, for example, in fish and amphibians. So that's an obvious morphological difference of dimorphism. The dimorphism can be drastic or slight. Again, if we go to the mammals, the dimorphism between gorillas is drastic. The dimorphism between humans is slight, but it's real. On average, the woman is about 4 to 6 inches smaller than the man. Again, we have to think of age, right? Because, for example, kids, they're still growing and so forth. So whenever we say that, we have to lock it into a particular age or age group. And usually it's the adult, because the juvenile, it's understood that the juvenile is still growing. In some cases, the dimorphism, there is no dimorphism. In other words, they look exactly alike. That happens a lot. It's interesting that in birds and fish in particular, you have both extremes. You have dimorphism, drastic dimorphism or extreme dimorphism, like, for example, the peacock and the peahen. Or you have no dimorphism, as in some parakeets that you really cannot tell them apart unless you actually send the feather away for DNA testing. Because by the eye, they look identical.
Is it true that clownfish is hermaphrodite, or is that
I don't know, to be short on the question, but I had never heard it. But it'd be interesting. Let's look it up and see what we come up with. Yeah, I had never heard that. And they tend to pair up like that in pairs. So the pairing typically points to male and female. But for sure, I don't know. I'll look it up and see. Where did you hear it?
After watching the movie Nemo, Finding Nemo?
Oh, yes?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
after
Oh.
watching that movie,
Oh, okay.
yeah, a lot of people I heard were talking about the hermaphrodite.
Oh, really?
I don't know. I've never followed up with it.
Oh, okay. Well, that may have its own agenda with regards to gender, sex and gender, and trying to blur the difference between male and female. It's like that other movie. We're getting this. It's so sad because this is going for children, right? For kids.
Yes.
The other one, the Pretty Feet or Happy Feet, or the one about the penguin.
Oh, Happy Feet.
Happy Feet. That was a homosexual penguin, and that's why it's called Happy Feet.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. There's an agenda, and this is being pumped out of the kids.
In that movie, Nemo, it had a high impact because kids started to want this fish. So they got, in places, they got almost extinct.
Oh,
because
wow.
they started to get it
Out of the sea.
Because kids wanted
They wanted a Nemo.
so
Wow, the clownfish.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Those are the negative consequences that can happen. Yeah. We have to be careful. Okay. So it's the sexual selection really is very sophisticated. We know that it occurs at all 4 levels. And typically it involves pheromones, which are sex hormones, right? They can be smell, but they can be other, they can trigger other reactions, and pheromones typically trigger some kind of a behavioral action. It has to do with displaying what we call fancy. For these are the fancy tails. These are, what are these? Anybody know? The Siamese fighting fish, right? Beta splendens, the beta fish. These are all males. The female is very, very drab.
You have to be alone. You cannot be together.
Correct, because they'll fight each other. These two fight each other to death, and that's, by the way, it's forbidden now because they have fights in Asia. So they come from what used to be Siam. What is that today? It's in Southeast Asia, and so yeah, and even that's a fancy female. These are typically female. These are the female betas. They're drab, and you can tell that the female is selecting on the male and not vice versa. It's not the male that's selecting on the female, because the female is not fancy looking, but the male is. For example, this one here. Okay, so that's a female. This is a male beta. Some are very fancy like that, and they flare out their they're just aggressive. They have a nasty disposition. They're really beautiful, gorgeous. Sometimes people put a mirror on them so they think they're fighting somebody else, another male competing. But it's stimulating the fish into being aggressive all the time, which is kind of cruel. Anyway, these in Asia, they do have fights with these fish, and they'll fight typically to the death. They'll rip each other's gills out, which is a fatal proposition. It's one of the few animals that actually fight to the death, males, but it's not very typical. Another example here at the morphological and behavioral, interesting. You get these elk that are two males definitely competing against each other. And then back here you got two mules or two females. One is interested, the other one is not interested. Right? She's even got her ears propped up to see, because they do clash and it makes a sound. And they hit each other. But it's mostly for display, and they'll push each other back and forth until eventually one of these two males is going to walk away. All right, and that will establish which of these two males is the alpha and which is the beta male. So we have this sophisticated type of behavior that is occurring at all four levels in sexual selection. But the important thing is that sexual selection is not random mating. It's chosen. So that is obviously selecting on the fanciness, on the most fancy characteristics, or the best characteristics, the most vigorous characteristics on the male and the female side. Then we get to the human selection, which is the most complex of them all, right? And this is just a scene from the disco scene from the 70s. Staying alive. Staying alive. Okay. We can see here that there's definitely a lot of behavior involved in this, and it's selection on both sides, right? It's selection on both sides, and there's a lot of selection that is subconscious that is going on that we don't really admit to it or not fully conscious of. But definitely there's selection on both sides, and it's extremely sophisticated, the most of them all. Different from runaway selection. Runaway selection happens in a few species, And here, the runaway selection, typically it's on the male. What happens is that the female becomes fixated with that particular characteristic, what particular trait, which is usually a morphological trait, all right, something structural that the male has, that the female, it catches her attention. And she just keeps focusing on that one characteristic over and over again, all right, the female, so it's locked in, if you will. So, for example, in some elk, the female locks into the size of the antlers. In the peacock is obviously the tail. But at some point, that tail, those antlers, become a survival disadvantage because it's so large, so heavy, so awkward. It gets in the way, they get trapped in the bushes and whatever, you know, and they get eaten up by, so they're not necessarily the most vigorous, okay, of the males. But the female got fixated on that particular trait or characteristic, so she keeps choosing that male. It also happens in some insects. For example, these are the beetle you see. This is the male. Sure. Why did this go around? The other way. Oh, I guess I had it flipped. Oops. So I'll correct it. Where is it here? It goes this way. That's why the sign of male and female. But to fit it on the photo, okay, that's why. Fit it here, I had to flip it around. So that's, it doesn't happen in all species, but when it does, we get typically what is called exotics, or these species that are extremely flamboyant, are very showy, all right? And typically it's the male that does that. Okay, so this is it for selection then. We talked first artificial selection, which is kind of an extension of what nature is doing, but we do it much faster. Then natural selection and all the forces acting there, pre-zygotic, post-zygotic, and then finally sexual selection, which is another layer, if you will, because natural selection does not account for, it's random. It doesn't account for male selection, for mate selection, okay? It's a different type. And all this could lead, eventually does lead to speciation as certain characteristics are highlighted, but especially when there is a climatological change. That's one of the big issues. When the climate changes, then significantly, then the resources are redistributed. And that could put a lot of selective pressure, especially on the weaker in society, in that population. Yep.
This only occurs on animals?
No, in plants too.
We have sexual reproduction in plants, right?
Yes.
So I can say that when the flowers are bigger and colorful,
Yes.
the insects pollinize, and that's a sexual selection.
Assuming that that's what the insect is going for, that's a good example actually, because you think of pollination, right? That enhances the reproduction of that particular flower, that particular plant. So what if you have a number of flowers and some smell more than others, all right? So the flower, let's say this flower that smells more in principle will attract more insects to it. Okay, so that's a selective advantage there. At what level is that? For example, of the four: morphological, physiological, molecular, or behavioral. A flower that produces more smell. It's molecular. They may all look alike, all the flowers look alike, but one flower is just producing more smell than another. Well, that smell, that's a chemical, right?
Yeah.
That's a pheromone, or it's a smell, so it's molecular. Morphologically, they all look alike, but the insect is zeroing in on the scent, right? So go for that flower. So that's a selective advantage.
And it's sexual because
it will be sexual reproduction, yes. And in fact, the flower is the sex organ of the plants. And those are typically what we call a complete flower. Complete flower is the one that has both the male and the female organs, because the center, the pistil, right, is the one that lodges the eggs inside the ova. And then the stamen or stamen are like little antennas on the outside that house the pollen. You can see the complete flower here, the center, which is the pistil, and there will be ovaries, which means that there are eggs inside the ova, inside the ovary. And then this is the stamen here, and contains the anther, which is the capsule for pollen. So they can self-pollinate, or they can pollinate another flower, but it has to be of the same species, because the pollen will be specific, right? And that's what we call complete flower. So a complete flower is both male and female, if you will. It has all the reproductive organs needed. Other flowers are incomplete. They only have pistil or stamen, and so forth, of the same species. And then you end up, when you have that, then you can actually have male trees and female trees of the same species. Mm-hmm. It also happens with pine trees. I know with conifers. Some conifers, some pine trees are complete. In that sense, they're hermaphrodite. They produce both cones and pollen. And other pine species, you have male and female. One tree only produces the cone for the female, and another individual of that species only produces the male cone for pollen. Okay, so you have both. But these slash pine that we have here, they have both. They have the cone, the female cone, and also the pollen also comes from a cone, but it's a smaller cone. It's called a male cone. It's much smaller and fuzzy. They're harder to see. Let's see, pine, male and female cones, so you can contrast them. Right. So you see, these are the cones that we're typically familiar with. Well, these are actually the female cone, the big woody ones with the scales, crusty. That's the female cone. That's mature, it's open up. This is the immature female cone, all right? And it's greenish and closed tight. Then these are the male cones, all right, which are the ones that produce the pollen. They're smaller, more fuzzy. For example, here, this is the male cones. These are several cones here. Each one of these is actually a cone. And that's the female cone there. Here, for example, you can see each one of these is a cone. It's a male cone or pollen. And these are only two female cones there. All right. Someone had a question? Emma? Yeah.
I was just curious, when let's say when the trees are diseased, does that kill the flower of the tree or anything?
Yes.
Come down?
Well, it depends on how diseased the tree is, right? How sick it is. Sometimes they get invaded by a number of insects, or sometimes there are blights. Sometimes there are viruses that infect the trees also, or bacteria. And it will kill the tree, but the tree, unlike an animal that dies fairly fast, you know, the trees sometimes die slowly, and some of the flowers or cones may still be working, functioning, if you will, for a while the tree is still dying. All right, so it may take some time. Yeah. Okay, so, well, that's what I have today then. Next time, I think we're going to go into adaptation of how what Mayer calls adaptedness. I think it's chapter 7. Into adaptation, how better adapted are the different organisms. Oh yes, the last thing I wanted to mention here with regards to selection So there's selective pressure. In principle, there's selective pressure all the time, whether it's natural selection or sexual selection is going on. It's all part of everybody's life, not only us, but all of nature. But the rest of nature doesn't practice medicine, okay? And this is an interesting phenomenon because with the practice of medicine, from one aspect, medicine is going opposite to natural selection, if you think about it. Because what does medicine do? Medicine enables the weaker ones, the ones who are ill, diseased, so you have an illness or disease or an injury. And there's a little saying that God always forgives, right? We say if we are repentant, God always forgives. Man sometimes forgives. Sometimes we hold grudges and we don't let go and we don't forgive. But nature never forgives. In other words, a weaker individual out there is likely to not survive. It's going to get eaten up, or it's going to die and rot away and not pass on its weaker genes. But what do we do with humans? Well, in the practice of medicine, we enable the weaker to continue living. Okay, so we can look at it from that perspective. And even the practice of pediatric medicine is even more drastic from that sense, because it's enabling the weaker young ones to make it to reproductive age. So pediatric medicine is even more, if you will, directly against natural selection. So how do we justify the practice of medicine? Because we're not going to stop the practice of medicine right now. Okay? We should continue with the practice of medicine. Even though it's going, we can say that in general, it is weakening our species, the practice of medicine as a whole. Of course, part of this is that even though we've had medicine, the practice of medicine, they call it the art of medicine, for the past several thousand years, you want to trace it back to the Greeks, 2,000-3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, even with the shamans and all the primitive things that were being done with herbs and so forth. Several thousand years is very little compared to the hundreds of thousands or millions of years that evolution has to work with and that it has taken for our species to evolve to what we are today. So medicine so far, we can say it's not really making that big of a negative impact on our species as a whole. Because in the meantime, what do we have? We have many populations of the world that have little or no access to medicine. And so those populations, human populations, are subject to natural selection. Again, the weaker ones in many parts of the world get selected out, typically as children. First of all, either they're not born, or when they're born, they don't have, they have malnutrition, whatever, they don't have enough resources, and they die. And in general, it's the stronger ones that are going to survive, right? Including behavior and survival skills and all that. So far, it's not really a big deal, if you will. The practice of medicine is still so rudimentary as far as the whole human population, the 7 billion that we are on Earth, that is not impacting the human population negatively, right? Because of many, many people who don't have access to medicine and are surviving and reproducing. But it is an issue how to justify the practice of medicine if it goes against natural selection, because we're denying natural selection to the whole species globally. And that's because we have certain values and principles that we hold. And one of those values is benevolence, right? That we have the capacity to will the good, bene volere. Bene is the good, bien, and volere is to will. Bene volere is to will the good. We have the capacity to will the good. In other words, if we see someone who is ill, we try to help that person naturally, spontaneously. There's a good will in our nature. And because we have the capacity for benevolence, then we should practice beneficence. Beneficence, bene facere, which means to do the good. we can will the good, therefore we should do the good. The beneficence. So really, medicine, the practice of medicine is beneficence. It's doing good, right? For other people who are weaker, who are ill, etc. And so these principles allow us to practice medicine even though it goes against natural selection. But we have these capacities and therefore we should exercise them according to our own nature. But I just wanted to point out that there is that one perspective that medicine goes against natural selection and pediatric medicine in particular, even more so, because it's enabling weaker children to reach reproductive age. Okay, so really that's all I have. Now we'll meet again next week, right? We have, or no, instead of, that's what, it's instead of next week, right? Let me check my schedule here for a moment. Yes, we actually switch. Oh yes, because I have that retreat next week. Yes, correct, right. So we don't meet next week. Our next meeting will be in 2 weeks, November 3rd. That will be our next meeting. Excellent. Okay, thanks again. And thank you, Giselle, also for coming in virtually.
Thank you, Father.
All right, my pleasure. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Yes, I'm going to stop the recording now.